We appreciate you attending our webinar on privacy today. This is being sponsored by the SCE Group. The SCE Group has been in business for about 13, 14 years now, and we really grew up in the identity access management space, but we've expanded our offerings, and we're really starting to concentrate on PCI audits, pen testing, and all things around assessments. We have quite a customer base throughout America. Our main focus of our business is in the Northeast, headquartered in New Jersey. And today I wanted to introduce a couple of folks. Well, I want to introduce Ben Flores. Ben is the CISO for the SCE Group, and he'll be our moderator today. And he's going to introduce Scott Foote. Just one thing on the phone. There are a number of folks on the phone, but we have quite a diverse folks of people on the phone today. There's a couple of colleges and universities where the CIOs are attending today. We have one or two CISOs that are on the phone today. A CISO that is a consultant now, but he was the CISO for one of the largest states in America. So we have a great diverse group of folks. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat room. Ben will facilitate those questions. And with that being said, Ben, the CISO of the SCE Group, it's all yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. Just want to remind, as Bob said, this session is being recorded. Great topic. Really, I'm looking forward to it. Scott, he is a veteran of the industry, 30 years of technology experience, and also has experience with the broader software industry. He has the ability to understand and map organizational needs to security models, architecture, solutions, and technologies. His primary area of expertise has been information security since the late 1980s. However, Scott's technical experience ranges from the operating system kernel technologies to file system, databases, information storage, network engineering, and others. And also more recent technologies such as cloud providers. Again, I'm the CISO. I'm not going to talk a lot. Mostly going to be handling questions. If you have any, raise your hand. I'll take them over for you. And then this is meant to be conversational and actionable, so you guys can do something right away with the information you presented today. The recording will be available midday tomorrow, I'm hoping, if everything goes well. With that said, Scott, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Ben. And I got to say, I'm envious of your office there where you're sitting. It's certainly a heck of a lot better than mine. Well, let's pretend this is the bridge of a company that I'm sitting in, but it's definitely not that cool. So thanks, Ben, for the introduction. Some just quick background up front. Yes, as Ben said, I'm a practitioner in the space, last 5, 6, 7 years. Privacy, both a professional, but an advocate. I carry a set of certifications, and I am a DPO for a couple of companies. That's built on my security background, as Ben said, since the 80s. Lots of certifications in the space, but the background in that area has been first and foremost as a product executive bringing security technologies to market. And in 2005 or 6, I pivoted more to the buy side to start to support the consumers and very large complex programs for, well, SMEs, but some very large organizations. I'm also an auditor. That is kind of an alter ego. So when I'm in a really bad mood, I decide to actually whip out the audit technologies and go to town. But in all seriousness, I'm certified. We do a lot of internal audits. There are, on rare occasions, where we do external audits. All of it's IT based, and it's all got an information security focus. Most importantly for today, I'm not a lawyer. We're going to talk a lot about privacy. There's a lot about privacy that is laid down in law, not just in the States, but internationally as well. So there's a lot of room for interpretation on what is or isn't privacy, or how you should be handling certain aspects of the data for certain data subjects. I strongly encourage folks to consult a qualified privacy attorney or a legal practice that focuses on privacy law, where your constituents are, where your data subjects are. I really don't think anybody at this point should be going without qualified legal counsel in the space. That said, many CISOs like Ben and I carry the burden of dealing with the privacy side of the business, and there's a whole emergent area of DPOs where it's people, some come from the legal side, some come from the technology side, but we're steeped in the application of traditional controls from the security space into the privacy domain. So we can certainly help, but don't treat that as a replacement for qualified legal counsel. So what I want to dive into here, and again, I'll invite Ben to interrupt me as questions come in, as folks on the line have questions. But typically, when I engage with a client, we lay out 5 basic elements of the program that they should be looking at to get started. And we use the acronym FACTS, F-A-C-T-S. First is foundations. We'll talk a little bit about getting started there, but don't be so concerned about plowing the green field that you don't get started. We'll talk about practical ways to get going literally today to get your program off the ground. The second are assessments. You'll probably hear a lot about PIAs or DPIAs. We're going to talk about those and their relevance. The third are the controls. Most of us come from a security background, so we're very familiar with the control space, but I want to talk about how I typically lay out controls for the individual risks that are exposed in those assessments. The fourth is transparency. This is where we want to look to do first attestation and then third-party verification of our attestations. That could take the form of just a third-party audit, or it may be as formal as a certification. So we'll talk about that, but transparency is fundamental in this space, not just in the security world, but in the privacy dimension. It's fundamental to getting our consumers and everyone in our supply chain to maintain that trust across all those relationships. The last piece is engaging with the subjects themselves. And how do we put together a program that allows us to engage with them in a very practical manner that is informative to them, but it also goes straight through to the requirements of the data subject requests when they come and ask us to fix information, or my favorite is the right to be forgotten, which exists in most privacy laws today. So that's the acronyms, FACTS. That is probably the first thing I would ask you to write down and remember from today's session, because that in most cases will give you a very solid background, a good foundation or a framework to build on as you get going with your privacy programs. So I'm going to jump into foundations, but I'll pause very quickly to see if Ben has any questions, if anything has come in yet. If not, then we're going to pry open the dirty can of worms that is foundations.
Let's get rolling.
Okay, good. This is a bit of an eye chart. I'm not expecting folks to be able to read this, but rather than giving you 5 long, tedious, unfolding graphics here about each of their 6, actually, of each of the components, I want to touch on them briefly. The first is scope. Most of the clients that we work with at Phenomenarty, when they initially say, we need a privacy program, they're thinking about the consumers that they're collecting information about. We need to think a bit more broadly, because all these international laws, they don't just deal with the consumers, they deal with all the stakeholders we gather privacy information on. Yes, it could be marketing in terms of who's coming into the environment and how are we tracking their interests on our website. It also includes, of course, all of our clients and customers, whether they are consumers or they themselves are companies. It includes all of that. Employees is one that is often overlooked by those of us that are just getting started with a privacy program. Vendors, yes, we should track all the vendors because we do have some PI or PII on vendors, and ultimately the end users. All of the end users, whether they're directly our clients or they're customers of our clients, all of that is the scope that needs to be considered. So let's not just pigeonhole ourselves into the consumer part of this as we're talking about putting together the program. The second thing to focus on is, what are the data elements? There's a lot of fungibility in terms of what is or what is not privacy data. It is determined by the law, the regulation that you are trying to comply with. There are many, many common elements like name, email address, things like that, date of birth, but we'll talk about that very, very briefly. It's very, very important that you understand each one of the regions that you need to adhere to those regional laws, and you go through what are your obligations in terms of declaring this is information that we collect. IP address is a perfect example. Some regional laws declare an IP address as being personally identifiable information. Others do not include that as PII. So we'll get into that in a little bit more depth, but those data elements are one of the first things that we need to really look at in our foundations.
So, a question on that, Scott.
Go, Ben.
The obviously all this is driven by legislation, right? The vast majority. But what are some data fields or data sources that may not be, there may not be laws to safeguard, but do you think in your experience we are overlooking or that we should be looking for?
And that's usually when we get outside of the basics, Ben. This is a really good question. But when you get outside of the basics, for example, if I am providing a consumer platform and the consumers come in and use it, let's say it's a shopping or retail environment. If I'm fingerprinting the device that they're shopping from, some regulations don't even get into touching that because it's a highly technical topic, and the law itself doesn't want to get into describing what is or isn't permissible. So they may not even touch it. Regulations like GDPR will say, absolutely, if you're fingerprinting the device, that's a unique device. So it's personal information. Where it needs to cross the boundary is that may be personal information because I'm always using the same device, but is it personally identifiable information? Can you uniquely identify me, the consumer, based upon that device fingerprint? And that's where there's a lot of gray area. Technologists, expert witnesses will weigh in when there's case law, but ultimately, from the legal side, legal is looking to abstract the types of data elements. And on the technology side, our answer has been, you know this one, it always depends, right? Well, what about if I'm fingerprinting not the device, but I'm fingerprinting your ISP and where you're coming from? You're always coming from a home modem or something like that. That when it gets down to it, this is why we need the legal practitioners to come in and help us and say, nope, case law has found that in Brazil, this is not considered to be PII, but in the European Union, this is considered to be PII. We really need their help. And what they're telling us is that some legal precedent has made the determination. It almost never gets down to a technical interpretation of what it is. IP address is one that I've personally been consulted on. Is an IP address something that's personally identifiable? And I always say, no, it's not. It can change. Yes, I use the same IP address from my home modem, but it can change. The real question is, can you discern me by that IP address? Can you uniquely identify me from that public IP address? And ultimately, of course, Ben, it depends. So, but this is one of the areas, I'll say it again, legal counsel is very, very helpful. And it's always better to over describe the data elements, even if you think it may not be in the context of PI or PII, it's better to declare that right up front. And I'll show you an example in the next slide of one client that actually does that and does it really, really well. The next piece of the foundation here is the why. And we can't get past this. Every single one of the privacy regulations, the laws that are out there today, whether it's international or states or provincial in Canada, everyone demands that you explain your lawful purpose. What is the lawful purpose for collecting and processing this privacy information? There's a range there. I really like the GDPR set. These are just some explanations, but very often in the broad consumer space, we usually go for the second one, the second bullet there, for the purpose or performance of a contract that the data subject is part of, or at the very bottom, legitimate purposes, legitimate interest. That you could drive a truck through. It's a very, very broad definition, but you need to start by explaining first to yourselves and then to your stakeholders, what is the lawful purpose? And for something like legitimate interest, you do need to refine that and provide more detail behind it. But this is an absolute requirement. Without this, you're going to wind up with fines from any one of these regulatory bodies. This other one is where we get into how do you process the information? And I really like data flow diagrams. And I'm not talking about a Visio diagram that's so overwhelming a layperson can't read it. I'll show you an example on the next slide. But something that says, here's where the end user is, here's how we collect it, here's what we do with it. We actually pass it to Google or Amazon or Azure. They are a sub-processor. Maybe we have other people that are coming in and looking at it and annotating or doing analytics on it. But that data flow is critically important to be able to explain that. First and foremost, we need to explain it to the supervisory authorities in all of the nations that we're trying to adhere to obligations in. That data flow diagram is probably the most critical in terms of getting your point across. What are you doing with the data? And as you see, as we unfold it, you'll explain what are your controls along the way. How are you protecting the data as it moves between all of these cooperating business entities? And where, of course, is it? Where is it ultimately going to be processed because of the extraterritorial nature of some of these laws? So the who and the where, those are exposed in those process diagrams. So, and why don't we actually go take a look at that rather than looking at this eye chart? Two things that we always start with, and this is another thing I'd ask you to take away today. This is a starting point, and it doesn't need to be exhaustive to get started. You can get started with an hour or two's worth of homework, and that will grow over time as more people come in and take a look at your assessments and what you're collecting. But to get started really doesn't require more than an hour or two. This table I really like. This is a real table. It's taken from a public website for one of Phenomenati's clients. And it's an inventory of the types of data down the left-hand column. These are the types of data that they collect: account data, customer records themselves, consumer or commercial rather information, device. This is, we talked about fingerprinting devices, some web analytics, some consumer demographics. The first thing that they explain is the data elements. What are they collecting? Is an email address, for example, is that truly PI or PII? And there's an argument that it is. In some laws, you have to combine it with a first name, last name before it becomes personally identifiable. Other things like the fingerprinting we talked about further down here, the device ID or the domain that you're actually browsing from. That's in the second column. What I really like about this table is this third column that says, here are the third parties that we might share some of this data with. We might be taking your IP address, for example, or your ISP, fingerprinting in the domain you're browsing from. We might pass that to a fraud analytics company to say, is this a high threat scenario, or is this something that is, a trusted IP as well as an individual? So this table is a very powerful table. You'll find that it grows over time. And as I said earlier in response to Ben's question, it's better to add things to this list, even if you think it may not be PI or PII. It's better to add to the list and ask a lawyer later if it's something that doesn't need to be here. But this is the first inventory we should all start with. And it's worth just getting started, right? Perfect is the enemy of the good. Just get started and let it grow. The second thing is an inventory, and this is a very painfully dense spreadsheet because we do this a lot. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see. This is simply an inventory. Each row represents a type of processing. For example, if we get our end users to come in and self-register, that's one type of processing where they create or they register their own account and they surrender a series of pieces of information during the registration process. First name, last name, birth date, maybe a government ID of some form, like we use social security numbers here in the States, or tax ID in Europe. Each one of the rows describes, what are you actually doing? What is the data you're collecting? Why? Do you need that data? In order to achieve the objective of that processing activity, do you really need the person's date of birth? Do you really need to know their gender? So you rationalize each one of your processing activities in this inventory. And again, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Simply get started. Most organizations do not need more than 5 to 10 processing activities to cover the gamut of what they're doing with privacy data. We can talk about a few examples in a moment, but this doesn't need to be exhaustive to get it off the ground. You will gather more information as you learn more about what you're doing with each one of these data types. But let's go back to the scope and recall that I often will use the examples of processing consumer data through like a SaaS platform don't forget we want to do this for HR. We want to do this for marketing and sales as well. We want to come up with the 3 or 4 activities of why we need the privacy information. Why do I need healthcare information about my employees in order to provide them benefits? That should be a processing activity that we collect that information and we provide benefits. That should be one row in what I typically do is separate worksheets for each of marketing, sales, HR, employees, vendors, and ultimately consumers. But this, don't let the density of the spreadsheet scare you off. This is something you can fill out, and it's very enlightening. It's also something that can be used to communicate to the board as you talk about the liability the company has in the data that it manages.
Indeed. I'm a huge fan of data flow diagrams for that specific reason. It helps you identify your crown jewels, right? So what are things that organizations often fail to account for while creating the inventories, while creating the diagrams in your experience?
They often start with just the pure, here's the data we collect. And they don't get into really what are they going to do with it after they've got the data. Marketing is a perfect example. Marketing will collect quite a bit of data from people browsing different websites. What we need to do is declare what are the analytics? What are we actually going to do with the data? Of course, we want the demographics of who is coming and visiting our site. We want to know who's repeating. We want to know where we're capturing interest. We want to be able to regionalize it. We really would like to perform those analytics. Most organizations, they start to lose track of the processing after the pure collection and storage. We actually have to document what are the processing activities because those have to be limited. In most cases, we have to tell the data subjects at the point of collection, we have to tell them what we're going to do with the data. We have to explain that. We're not free to simply add on more analytics because we found we've got a treasure trove, excuse me, of privacy data or personally identifiable data. We can't simply add more processing activities without first notifying, in most cases, asking for consent from the data subjects. Many of the organizations, not the ones I've dealt with personally, but the ones that I have seen struggling and getting fined, this is where things break down. They do the upfront foundational work, but once they get a hold of the data, we call it a privacy piñata. They just keep gathering the data. They see, wow, this is so rich. Look at what we can do with all of this data. And they lose sight of the obligations that they're not free to do anything they want.
Just briefly, one episode that comes to mind for me while I was working with a client doing basically this, a business process flow, data flows, and all this activities. One of the sections that we had to do was the business justification, right? Why are we capturing these fields? Why are we doing it? And the example was reversed. They ended up figuring out that they didn't need to capture everything because we don't do anything with that field. So in this case, it was a software development company. So they went in and changed that. So it also helps you minimize your footprint when it comes to data privacy.
Absolutely. We had the very same example just over the course of the last few months, where a particular SaaS-based platform was picking up information about data subjects, not consumers, but employees in the workplace. And one of the things that they had allowed their clients to present to them were the actual names of these people. And my response was, you're the SaaS provider, why do you need the names of these people? All they needed was a unique identifier. That could be just some numeric number that it was assigned in the platform. They didn't really need it. And until we filled out this spreadsheet at the top to say we're actually capturing this information, the metadata describing the person is part of it. And I simply asked that question, Ben, why? What would you do with that? Why do we need it? If we are the SaaS provider, if our customer already has that, we don't need the rest of the personally identifiable metadata. Let's drop it. It's a good exercise to refine those expectations and do data minimization. Collect only that which you really need to achieve the objective of the processing. So this activity or exercise of filling out these spreadsheets can be very, very useful to companies in minimizing their risk. So, and Ben, you mentioned the data flow diagram. I just laid out 5 across the bottom here. I personally spent a lot of time in Visio, but I find that when I've done diagrams in Visio and then I hand it over to a general counsel or someone like that at one of our clients, they don't have Visio. So we started to do this in PowerPoint and hand it over to them so they can enhance it and maintain it. One of the most important attributes of this data flow diagram, this format that I like to use, are these horizontal swim lanes. And I found that the supervisory authorities like these as well, where we talk about the data subjects first at the top. Who are the data subjects and what are they? What is their role in terms of either surrendering or presenting the information? This is just account registration. This is one example of a type of processing, but are they the ones that actually hand over the information, or is it the data controller? The data controller that's collected the information and is on their behalf setting up accounts. Then who is the data processor? If the controller is managing those consumers, think maybe a retailer, they may not be the processor. The processor could be somebody else entirely. Like Salesforce is a processor. For those of us that have Salesforces capturing our client information in Salesforce, Salesforce is the processor. Those of us that collect the data, we are the controllers. And the data subject is, of course, our clients. But we also want to acknowledge the data center dependency. This is critically important. Most of these laws are written as though the data centers are inside of our companies and physically resident somewhere in a country. More and more, that is, of course, not the case. We're using the large cloud providers like Google or Amazon or Azure. So we do need to document that that's where we're doing our processing and our storage is actually being done in data centers, and we do need to document where they are. It's not sufficient to just say it's in GCP. Well, where are you hosted with GCP? Is it in Europe? Is it in North America? Is it in the Philippines? Is it in the Far East? So these data flow diagrams become very, very powerful when you're explaining what you do to a layperson, such as supervisory authorities. You can follow the data flows. The circles are the verbs or the activities, and the rectangular boxes, those are the data elements being passed between the functions. And of course, we have these points, these little blue padlocks. This is where I typically will depart with a supervisory authority, and I'll say, here's what we're doing here for this particular transfer of data. We're protecting it. It's fully encrypted in the stream. Maybe it's just HTTP over TLS. Maybe we're using IPsec. Maybe I've encrypted it before I'm even putting it out on the pipe at the application layer. But the point is, I can explain with the movement of every one of these data elements through all these different parties, I can explain how we're protecting it, all the way down to things like a cross-border transfer. Many of these swim lanes require a cross-border data transfer. That, of course, the supervisory authority is going to say, how are you protecting that, Scott? How is your organization protecting it administratively? So we'll get into controls in a minute. But the power of these data flow diagrams, this is the third thing I'd say, guys, take a screenshot. But this type of an expression, the simplified data flow diagram, is extremely powerful when you're creating clarity on what it is your company does and how you're implementing controls along each one of these data flows to make sure that you're living up to the obligations to protect this data. Ben, any thoughts or comments on that? I know you're just as excited about data flow diagrams as I am. They're quite a powerful tool.
No, this is pretty good. Thank you, Scott.
So let's get into the A from FACS, from the FACS acronym. The foundations, as you might guess, that's 60% of the work that you're going to do to set up your program. But let's talk about the types of assessments, because there are two that come up over and over again with privacy. The first is the PIA, or Privacy Impact Assessment. The second is the DPIA. I often hear people talk about these interchangeably. They're not. The PIA, first and foremost, says if you've got a new business system or a modification, just do a high-level assessment. Are you working with any privacy data at all? Or are you changing the privacy data or processing that you have done in the past? That's the first question. Because if you're not dealing with privacy data, or nothing has fundamentally changed since the last time you reviewed your environment, then you basically exit here. You don't need to do a deeper analysis. But if you get to the third step there, performing the privacy threshold, and you decide, you know what, we're gathering more data, we're adding more processing of the data, we've got 10-fold times the number of consumers that we're looking at now. The privacy threshold analysis is the trigger point to say, we really need to do a more robust DPIA, the data protection impact assessment or analysis. And that will go look at one of those flow charts and it will ask all those questions along the way. Are we doing everything we need to do? Or in the new flow, what will be the new controls that need to be added to protect the privacy as it's of that data as it's passing through the workflow? That's going to be fundamentally important, and it's going to expose some risks along the way. If it doesn't, well, probably it's not a very exciting change to your business system. But first, the PIA triggers whether or not you do the DPIA, and then the DPIA is going to expose risks that need to be treated.
And so you have, we're reviewing existing controls, right? So I don't know if you know this. Is there any particular security framework that is better for data privacy than others? That would help us set us up to this?
I wouldn't say any are better than others. Some are more comprehensive. So I'm fond of the NIST privacy framework, which builds on the NIST cybersecurity framework. The reason why I'm fond of it is because it's very easy for me to articulate to the senior leadership of a company or to the board and explain this is a framework that is growing in popularity, but I can explain it at a level that they understand where I don't get into the depths of cross-border transfers and why we're encrypting and when we're encrypting or whatnot. So I do like the NIST privacy framework, but when we really talk about looking internally to the program, a much more robust standard is the ISO 27701 standard. That extends ISO 27000 specifically for privacy. And frankly, it's really quite good. I mean, there are many ISO standards that I think are quite good. Others need work, but 27701 is an outstanding extension to the 27001/2 series that speaks to what are our roles as controllers or processors, and what should we be thinking about over and above the 114 controls in 27001 to make sure that we are living up to our obligations as stewards of privacy data. So those are the two I think that are leading. ISO is the more broadly adopted internationally, and it's even referenced in some of the legislation. So that's mostly in the addendums to the legislations as those are coming out for different nation states. So let's.
Scott, I wanted to do a quick time check here. We've scheduled this for 45 minutes. I know that we've allotted a little more time, but I just wanted to say 10 minutes left, folks, if you need to drop in that 10 minutes. But also, if you have a pressing question that you're kind of scratching, should I ask the question? You're going to want to get that in. And as you can probably tell, Scott will be very thoughtful in how he answers it.
Thanks, Bob. So, Ben, interrupt me if you've got any more questions in the stream, obviously, but I want to jump quickly through controls. This is just a primer. This is often what I use with executive teams. So I would imagine most of the folks on this call already have a sufficient background in the types of controls that are available today. The two dimensions we're going to look at in a graphic in a second. Administrative, physical, technical, those are the types. But then preventative, detective, and corrective, that's along the potential attack vector of an adversary. And it's going to look very, very familiar in terms of the different information security controls that can be applied. But there's two things that I want to touch on here before we depart the conversation. The first is these cross-border transfers. Most of the controls here are administrative. Now, GDPR is my favorite example because it's one of the more mature sets of requirements here. But when you need to declare, when you do declare you're doing a cross-border transfer and you need to declare what controls are being applied, first and foremost, historically, we've looked at adequacy decisions out of the European Union. Does the country where the data is being transferred to, do they as a government, do they respect privacy? So the adequacy decisions are out there. Your legal support, they will help you determine where these adequacy decisions exist. The European Union used to have one with the US, and that was actually overridden almost 2 years ago now by Max Schrems in what's called the Schrems II decision. And ultimately, it's forced us to use some of these other mechanisms like standard contractual clauses, which we put into a data protection agreement or a data privacy agreement, a DPA. Those are used very broadly today. BCRs are typically used by very large enterprises that are moving data around different physical geographies, but they're doing so internal to their own company. And BCRs are complex code of conduct. They do need to be filed and approved first with a supervisory authority before you can lean on them. So cross-border transfers do require administrative controls. You're going to spend a lot of time in this space understanding and then building an appropriate set of controls. But SCCs are pretty much what most of us use today, where there's no adequacy agreement. The second is just this idea of anonymizing or pseudonymizing the data right up front. Ben, you pointed that out earlier. If you don't need those data elements, don't collect them. If you're collecting the data and it's just part of the inbound stream at your collection point, then anonymize the data before you store it, before you process it. If you don't need to identify the individual, then simply don't do it. And you'll mitigate the risk both to yourself, everyone in the supply chain, and ultimately to those data subjects. So I think it's overlooked. I don't think people spend enough time considering the power of the anonymization as far up in the collection stream as possible. The rest of these controls, as I said, this is just a graphic I've used in a variety of other webinars, but I lay out the types of controls, whether it's physical, gates, guards, etc., administrative policies and procedures, and technical. And then where are they in terms of, are you preventing, correcting, or preventing, detecting, or correcting a potential breach? So it's another eye chart. Most of us already have this in our back pocket. The only point in showing it here is that this particular matrix has proven very powerful in the boardroom. When I've gone into the C-suite or into the boardroom, I don't fill it out as densely as you see here, but I will explain why we have a policy or a procedure and why we have a physical, why the room where our people that are working on credit card information is physically monitored. Why do we have to have that physical monitoring in there? And ultimately, what are the technical controls we're building for data loss prevention and that type of a thing? So it's a powerful way of laying it out without completely overwhelming a non-technical audience. So let's start to land this then. I've swapped the transparency and subject topics here. First, I want to touch on engaging with these subjects. There are 4 or 5 things you've got to keep in mind in your program. The first is unavoidable. You must provide notice. What are the data elements and what's the processing you're going to do with the data? You must do it, regardless of which of the international laws you're adhering to. Your privacy policy should be clearly written, easily discoverable somewhere on your website, and almost always it needs to be available directly at the point of collection. So if you're asking me for my social security number and birth date, that should be immediately associated with the privacy policy, which explains why. The second is consent. Now, internationally, it's opt-in. We need to consent to opt-in in almost every one of the newer privacy laws. In the States, it's still opt-out. I think that may change. It's going to take years, but I think it may change as well. But make it very, very clear. As you begin to ask these questions, make it clear that the data subject should be providing their consent explicitly. And if they ever decide to remove or revoke that consent, you need to provide an easy mechanism. They should be able to find it just as easily as opting in during a registration process, for example. They should be able to opt out. The next piece is the data subject request program. And this is a place I see people fall on their faces, to be totally blunt. They aren't prepared. So they get their first right to be forgotten request, and they scramble and they immediately start deleting records from whatever their databases are. They even delete emails of any requests coming in from that individual. That's usually where I say, just stop. We've got to establish a process. We may need to forget some of the information, but let's first look at what is our legal requirement, not just to forget, but to remember. In many cases, we may still need to keep track of the fact that they were a consumer or a client. We may not need all the identifiable information, but we can't simply expunge them from their, ever having existed in our databases. We may have legal requirements or regulatory requirements to keep that. We don't need to delete their request coming in. In fact, we have to legally keep the request to say Ben requested that he wanted to be forgotten. That request in its own nature has to be maintained so that we can prove to regulatory bodies that we're actually following a process here. So that's critically important, putting together a program that understands how are you going to deal with it. And in many cases, people do this asynchronously through an email. If the consumer has a portal that they can log in to the environment, all of these requests should be manageable directly through that portal. build it directly into the portal where the individual can say, look, I want to close my account. Here's a request to be forgotten. So that all of it is dealt with in a very simple and canonical way that doesn't require going through help or support or somebody like that, or calling the DPO. And of course, the most critical one here is breach notification. All the laws have different requirements for breach notification when you tell the data subject. Even the EU updated their guidelines on breach notification just a month ago in the middle of November to make them more practically oriented. Almost every one that exists today says within 24, 48, or 72 hours. We all know that's often very impractical because we don't even know what data, let alone who, was exposed in a breach. We need time to do the investigation. The new guidelines from the European Union are going to relax that a little bit and make it more practically oriented. But understand, we have the obligation. We should practice this first. Don't wait for a breach to figure out how you're going to do notification. Practice it in a tabletop exercise. Get yourself ready and know what the process looks like and who will execute it. And then landing on transparency. There is no trust without transparency. That doesn't mean invite everyone in the world to come in and audit your entire program, but it does mean look for places where you can adhere to an international standard, look for places where you can get certified against standards and regulations. The example that I painted a little bit earlier for Ben was the 27000 series. The ISO 27000 series, very popular. And in this space of privacy, 27701 is the most relevant. I do imagine over the course of time, 27701 will be integrated in as part of the base 27000 series. But today it's separate, makes it easy to read. But this is today one of the most powerful things we can do. And yes, you can be certified against 27701. You can go through an external audit, get the certification, apply for it, and you can receive it from ISO. Another one, though, is this idea of industry regulations or standards that are from vertical industries. My favorite here is PCI DSS because so many organizations deal with payment information. So how do we go through that? Understand what level compliance you need. There are 4 different levels as defined today by the PCI Council. And level 4 is just getting started for startups with less than 20,000, I think is the break point. 20,000 to $1 million is level 3. Up to level 2, that's $1 million to $6 million. But once you get over 6 million end users, you are required. It's no longer a good idea or recommended. You are required to go through third-party attestation. You do your attestation, your AOC or your ROC, where you report your compliance, but third parties will come in and audit you. And once you get up to that level 1, you're being audited annually, and you might even be being scanned. The PCI Council requires an approved scanning vendor to come in and scan your environment to prove that what you have attested to is, of course, true. These can be very, very powerful, not just to keep you honest, but they're the root of trust. If you will establish any trust with these consumers, it will be through continuous third-party attestation, independent objective reviews of your program and the controls you have in place. Those are very, very powerful. They'll also get you out of the continuous loop of answering security questionnaires from every entity that you deal with in your supply chain. So those are the facts: foundation, assessment, controls, transparency, and engaging with the data subjects. This is a starting point. We hope that you've taken 4 or 5 simple ideas away from this set of concepts that you can operationalize literally this week. The holiday break is often a good time to sit back and reflect and say, where can I start? How can just one individual get started to build out this program? And once you've got it going, bring in external third parties. You can bring them in to consult as you're going through it, or get ready to bring them in for these third party assessments. And the certifications are ultimately where you want to get. I think that is the brass ring of the privacy programs that we're standing up today.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. You just mentioned PCI DSS as an example that I was giving earlier. Was it was a PCI client where we were working to do the data flows during the scoping phase, and that's something the SE group does. So we do, like as Scott mentioned, anything from for service providers to we're able to deliver a ROG and an AOC for you, but this is something that we definitely have experience on.
And many folks that deal with the payment card information, they don't really know where they are and which layer and how they need to do the attestations. They could really use guidance from organizations, Ben, like yours, just to get started and say, where do I need to get in terms of my compliance? And then how do I achieve that compliance with a third-party review of my attestations?
And just as a point for PCI, one of the things, I think you mentioned something like this earlier. One of the things that the council is interested in seeing is that not only are you doing your yearly activities, you have to show business as usual. So everything that they have told you that they need it needs to be present throughout the year. And that's what I've seen organizations sometimes lapse doing certain things. And that's where we can help find and remediate as well.
Yeah, the idea of just simply baselining and then thinking you're done, yeah, that doesn't fly with these types of regulatory bodies. You've got to show that this is standard operating procedure once it's established.
Well, Scott, we really appreciate your time today. Folks on the line, we will send you a copy of this recording, and we encourage you to share it with not only your team members, but your colleagues if you know somebody that may be of interest in it. We'll use that as a follow-up for the SCE group in terms of if there's anything else that you'd like to look at in terms of your continuous compliance requirements. We'd enjoy chatting with you more about that. But if nobody else has any questions, we'll pause for 3 seconds. If somebody has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. But if not, everybody have a great holiday, and we'll take it down. We'll let it sit for 2 or 3 seconds here, and if no questions, everybody having a great holiday season. Thanks again, Scott. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Ben, thank you very much for hosting.
Thank you all. Thank you, Scott. Safe holidays, everyone.
Stop that recording, Ben, or it'll be 9 hours long.